It's my fault.
Hello and welcome to From Silverware to Workwear, Manufacturing 1920 Style with Eliza West. My name is Tom Geiler. I'm the Director of Museum Affairs here at the Oneida Community Mansion House. And we're coming to you live from the new library at the Mansion House that residents get to enjoy on a daily basis. It's also quite hot in here, so those of you on Zoom, lucky to be in your air conditioning. We're thrilled to continue our lecture series on women's fashion in the 19th and 20th century. The last time we left you, we were immersed in the short or reform dress of OC women in the 19th century. And today we're moving ahead in time to talk about women's fashion in the 1920s, a time when the United Community Limited was selling community plate all over the country and the world and becoming a household name. Though today is on Zoom, we do hope you'll take the opportunity this summer to come and visit us in person. Indeed, when you come to visit us, you'll find a vibrant Oneida Community Mansion House, a National Historic Landmark, 501c3 nonprofit that was founded in 1987. We'll be celebrating 35 years this year. Today, it's part museum, part historic inn, and a home for about 40 people. Our mission is to use our historic site and collection to share the story of the United Community, one of the most radical and successful of the 19th century social experiments, to explore pressing issues that still confront audiences today. All of this is supported through a variety of means. Of course, tour admissions, which we had a few people on tour today, special museum events like this one, in-revenue, event rentals, and apartment rents are all part of it. We're also funded through local, state, and federal grants and the generosity of private foundations. However, our most important source of revenue is individuals like you who help donate to help support all we do here at the Mansion House. And today, in particular, we're grateful to Humanities New York for funding both of these lecture series, as well as the improvements to tours and things that have to do centering on women's history. Before I get started, I do have a couple housekeeping items for folks. First and foremost, we're trying something, again, new today. As you saw us kind of fumble a little bit, we apologize, but it's a hybrid format. That means we have a live audience here at the Mansion House, as well as on Zoom. So please be patient with us. We may encounter the occasional kink. If you have any issues, please use the chat box, which I'll be monitoring over there. It is a webinar, so do not worry if you can't see other panel or other presenters or other people on the Zoom. You will not be on camera or audio. So in other words, you'll only be able to see and hear the speaker, myself, and any audience questions. Following Eliza's talk, there'll be a Q&A session that will engage folks here at Mansion House as well as on the Zoom. For folks on Zoom, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom window to ask questions. I will then feed those to Eliza, and Eliza will repeat them just so we can all hear. I think the mic's pretty good, but we'll just make sure everyone can hear from home. If you have any technical issues or comments, please use the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom window. Eliza will be alternating between PowerPoint slides and live demonstration here at the library. So there will be a little bit of a multi-window experience. We hope we've gotten all the kinks out. For folks here at the Mansion House, just a few housekeeping items. One is there is exits right outside the library door as well as the front door. And there are bathrooms as well down to your right outside the library. I just want to inform you of a couple upcoming things we've got going on at the Mansion House. The first is this Wednesday. Mike Colmy, the Director of Buildings and Grounds, will be giving a walking tour outside that'll traipse all around the Mansion House, all around the Kenwood area, highlighting historic preservation and the many architectural styles, like architectural library really, that exists here in Kenwood. We'll be ending that with a very special happy hour at the United Community Golf Course, where your ticket will get you a free drink as well as some free appetizers. The cost is $30, but again, as I said, it does include some refreshments. On July 13th, we're having a free children's event, courtesy of CNY Arts, that would children can take a piece of slate left over from our roof rehabilitation project and make a one-of-a-kind painting or craft out of it to take home. See our webpage for more details. So without further ado, I'll introduce Eliza West. I first met Eliza in the spring of 2017 when she entered the literature program in American Material Culture at the University of Delaware. I soon discovered Eliza to be a powerhouse student at once home with 18th century dress, 19th century architecture, and 20th century oral histories, and fascinated by all kinds of different objects, peoples, landscapes, and even infrastructure. Indeed, if you're ever interested in bridge and highway construction, please ask Eliza. She'll tell you all you need to know. Just ask her about the road delta. Eliza West has degrees from both the University of King's College and Dalhousie University, as well as the University of Delaware in the literature program in American Material Culture. With skills in fundraising, historical costuming, and material culture research, Eliza's held positions at Fort Ticonderoga, the Heritage Winooski Mill Museum, Willing Hands, Friends of the Lost Mural, and is currently the Communications and Operations Director for the Vermont Folklife Center. One of the pleasures of this job is inviting my former students, current colleagues, and friends to the Mansion House, and I'm proud to call Eliza home. So welcome, Eliza.
Thank you, Tom. It's me centering myself on screen here. I think I'm doing okay. Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Tom, for inviting me. This is a very fun opportunity to get to do. It's a really fun kind of talk that I love to do, which is combining presenting some research and some information with a live demonstration of some historical costuming, some garments. So I really enjoy approaching history through clothing. I have training as a historical costumer, and I worked for many years as a costumer and a historic interpreter at Fort Ticonderoga. And the thing that I really loved about that job was that people would walk into my space and we would start a conversation about a piece of clothing. And then that conversation could move to talk about politics or war or big social themes or what's going on in philosophically at that moment in time. And all of those themes could start from a single piece of clothing. And I think one of the reasons that clothing is able to do that is because it's something that we all put on every morning. There is no way for us to sort of go through life without thinking about clothes and without having a relationship to clothing. And so it's an incredible inroad for someone into another moment in time, because it's really easy to sort of put yourself in someone else's clothes and think about that experience and think about how it's analogous to your life in some way. So that's sort of my approach, my interest in dress history. And I do think of myself as interested in dress history rather than fashion history, because my interest comes not so much from what is the high style at this moment in time, but rather from why did this piece of clothing get made this way? What stitches were used? Is there a reason? What were the materials? How was this clothing being worn? How did it affect or relate to the work that people were doing in it? And so when I study clothing and when I create reproduction garments, I'm doing it typically from this idea of can we think about working people? What are they wearing? Why does the clothing look that way? Why does it act that way? And that's kind of always going to be my path in. Why the 1920s? This is, it's not the most obvious connection here at Oneida, so forgive me, you're getting another interest of mine thrown in here. When the 1920s is a time period that many of us have a mental image for, from reading The Great Gatsby to getting invited to a 1920s themed New Year's Eve party and buying a sparkly dress to watching Downton Abbey. We have a good idea of what it looks like, kind of. We have a good idea of what it looks like to go to a party and to put on a lot of sequins and a little bit of fringe, right? And this is this kind of surface level idea, entry point into this other moment in time, but we can go so much deeper. And we can look at that moment in time on different class levels and literally on different levels of an outfit. And so it's a great moment to dig deeper on because everybody has a little bit of conception on it, and it means we can go really deep and get to really interesting places. So that's my project for today. So the structure for our talk is going to be a very quick intro with a little bit of information about the Oneida community. Most of you know much more about this than I do. I think there maybe are a few people on Zoom who don't, who are friends of mine. So I'm going to give just enough information to tie in and make some context. And then I'm literally going to dive into my wardrobe here, and we're going to go piece by piece through my clothing, talking about the design influences that make it the way it is, and building connections to bigger design trends. And through that, talking a little bit about what's going on with Oneida cutlery, because it's all the same thing. The same design influences are touching all of these things. And they're touching our lives today too. And so hopefully at the end of this, you have a sense of some of that, that sort of patchwork of influences that informs this moment in time that I'm portraying. But you are also able to use that to look at the world that you live in today with some different perspective. Stop and drink some water so I can still say words. Okay. And as Tom said, I'm gonna try and switch back and forth between slides and showing you what's going on my body, and that's complicated and untested water. So hopefully it goes smoothly, but forgive me if we have some hiccups along the way. Like changing slides, for example. That should be easy. How about that? How about this? Interesting. How about this? Look at the actual button. Ah, there we go. Just got to do it the hard way. That works. So what is the Oneida community? Allow me to say as little as possible so I don't embarrass myself in front of my former professor. This is a religious community, intentional utopian community, founded in the middle of the 19th century. It practices communal living. It practices complex marriage, which is a form of polyamory, and it aspires to greater gender equality than is present in the rest of the world in the middle of the 19th century. All of this gets funded through a series of different industries. Fruit canning, so growing and preserving fruit, creating silk thread, sewing thread, hunting traps, and then finally manufacturing cutlery. And a lot of people who know the Oneida name know it from the cutlery because that is the piece that lasts the longest. Let's roll back and talk again for a second about that mention of greater gender equality. So what does that look like at Oneida? It looks like better access to education, much more parity in types of work being done. So both genders doing a lot of types of jobs that might otherwise be gendered one way or the other. And we can see that on the, where do I gesture? On the screen. My understanding of this image is that we have a woman from the Oneida community standing here. She's overseeing workers who are not from the community, and we can differentiate between them by their dress, and talk about that in just a second. And she's overseeing what's going on, but she's also reading because she likes to read. She has this amazing library at her fingertips, not this one, a different one. So this is an example of one of these images we might see of a woman who's part of the Oneida community. What's going on with her clothing? For anyone who saw Laura Ping's talk, the previous talk in the series, you got a lot of detail into reform dress and what exactly is going on in this illustration. She's wearing a hybrid between the fashionable clothing of the mid-19th century and something closer, something less structured, something less fashionable that's theoretically easier to move in, a reformed style of clothing that is meant to make her life a little bit easier and maybe to make it a little bit more similar to the way a man can move through the world. So her dress is shorter. She's wearing pantalettes underneath it, some kind of leg wear so that it's extending the fabric of the dress down, but not as a long skirt. She's not wearing a giant hoop skirt. This is the era that's gone with the wind era of massive crinolines. And she has her hair cut short. So this is reform dress. It shows up here at the Oneida community, and then it starts showing up at other places, other groups of women who are thinking about how to reform society in the middle of the 19th century. Some of the suffragists are engaging in this type of clothing. The most famous person is Amelia Bloomer, who's a reporter who's like, yeah, this is amazing. This is way more practical and comfortable. And it has kind of a short moment of success because it is pretty radical. It's pretty out there for this moment in time. But it's not just the folks here at the Oneida community who are taking it on. So we see many, many iterations of this. For example, so here's a group shot of the community here at the Mansion House, and then I've just overlaid on that on the slide another example of reform dress. This is not associated with the Oneida community, just to say this isn't the only place that this is happening. So the thing I want you to notice about this is the groups of women who are wearing reform dress are aspiring to greater gender equality, but they're not wearing men's clothing. So the clothing isn't the same. It's just a little bit better, a little bit freer. And there isn't really an attempt to make everything the same. So there's still a very clear distinction here between genders. I just want to point that out. Great. The Oneida community comes into being right at the middle of the 19th century. It survives in that form for a few decades. In the late 19th century, the nature of that community changes. I think this is often the case with utopian communities where they survive for a generation or so and the leader gets old or steps down and things change. And what happens with Oneida is that it goes from being a communal living arrangement to a joint stock company, which is a really sort of fascinating transition. And I think it plays on this funny dynamic between communal living and being really good capitalists. And so the focus switches to being really good at that capitalism. That means that this idea of equality between the sexes kind of goes by the wayside. That stops being the case. What does do really well is the coloring business. So this sort of ends up being the direction that the energy of the Oneida members of the Oneida community are going. It's a second and third generation. Second generation, the children of the original founders who are really pushing this business forward. And it starts to really take form in the early 20th century, which lines up well with this time period that I'm here to talk about. Let's look at another picture. Okay. This is an image of suffragists from Oneida. So it's really hard to see on the screen here, I think, and I don't know how it is on Zoom. The woman in the middle, who looks so scary, is holding, I think, a football that says "Votes for Women 1917." And so one of the things that I think is interesting is that we have the early period of the Oneida community where there's all of these sort of radical progressive ideas being brought forward. They fade off towards the end of the 19th century, and then they start coming back as much more mainstream ideas in the early 20th century. And one of those ideas is the votes for women's suffrage. And we see that happening here in Oneida. We see people supporting this idea. For me, this feels like 19th century radical ideas getting normalized, coming into the mainstream. There are other forces at play in women's lives at this point in time as well. And a big one, and this is at play in everyone's life, is the First World War. And we hear more about women going to work in the Second World War. That's the narrative, I think, that's more common for us because we have the figure of Rosie the Riveter. But this is absolutely also happening during the First World War. And so these are images of women working in Oneida, and we think it's maybe doing some munitions work, which is essentially retooling a factory to do something for the war effort. And instead of having male workers in there doing these jobs, having women in there because the men are off fighting. And we're going to see that the clothing for work like this adapts. So these women are wearing shirtwaists and skirts. This is very sort of standard work wear or office wear for women in the 19-teens. But there are also women who are doing harder jobs that really require more protective clothing and clothing with pants. So this is a garment that I sort of stumbled across while I was doing research into textile mills in Vermont, and I fell in love with it. And then I fell extra in love because I did some research and I realized that it's called a womanall, and that just cracked me up. And I said, I have to have one. So I made myself a womanall, which is obviously what I'm wearing here for you all right at the moment. And the thing that I think is really interesting about this garment, what it has in common with the reform dress in some ways, is that it's trying to do some of the same things as men's clothing, but it is not a piece of men's clothing. It is cut differently. And I think one of the major differences that we see is that it is still making an effort to obscure the idea that women have legs and butts. So there's like a lot of material here. And it's doing that deliberately to be like, okay, you have the functionality of pants, but you also have additional modesty or sort of cover. Yeah. So again, it's doing the same. It's trying to do the same thing as men's clothing. It's not men's clothing. The next thing that I'm going to do is take this off and show you the layer I have on underneath. Before I do that, I want to point out one really awesome thing about this garment. So if you put this on to work in a factory all day or to work on the farm all day, it's a real pain to fully change out of it to go to the bathroom. This is a garment that comes with a back flap that fully unbuttons, and I can't like take it off without showing you that, since it's really hilarious. So an interesting piece of technology for this clothing, right, to increase the wearability. Okay, I'm gonna turn off the screen share for a second. Is that right? I think that's right. Yep. Okay, so I want to show you the layer of clothing that's underneath this. It's my underwear. It's more clothing than many of you have on right now because it's that kind of time period. So this guy unbuttons. Last button, there are 2 snaps. Oh, very important. There are buttons at the knees. That's a really good way to get trapped in your clothes. And then I have to see if I can take this off over pants or over shoes. And as I do this, if you have like clothing questions, feel free to ask. Okay, there we go. I'm free. Very free. So I still have a lot of layers of clothing on. Actually, I want to show you. I'm going one further. Excuse me. Still a lot of clothes. Just really good to have a fan too. So I want to talk from the inside out. So I'm going to talk about the piece of clothing I have on closest to my skin, which is this. And this starts about here, and it comes up, and these are the straps here. It's a union suit. So it's the bottom half and the top half of underwear together in one garment. Most of us have heard of union suits in other contexts. It's like a full piece of long underwear, often in red, often like worn by lumberjacks. And one of the cool things about this piece of clothing, this one really is universal across genders. There are versions of this for men, for women, for children, and there are versions that go from the wrist and ankle up to the neck, and versions like this that are short in the leg and have like spaghetti straps for a really low profile under something. This one is cotton. They are also made in silk and wool. Obviously, we think of the ones that are made in red. At this point, most of them are sort of underwear colors, so white or cream or pink. Same situation with going pee, by the way. This is also a garment that has a flaps that I can go to the bathroom without having to strip. That is very, very inconvenient. Because of course I am also wearing a corset. So that's this guy right here. This is a really sort of late in the history of corsetry. It's not doing what we think of a corset doing in the 19th century, which is like cinching in your waist and pushing up your bust. We have moved on from that in terms of what is fashionable and in style. And so this corset actually starts here and it comes down to low on my hips, right? And this reflects what's going on in the fashion of this time period. This is a moment where the silhouette is very long and slender and straight. That's not a silhouette that works particularly well on my body. So this corset is kind of doing the best that it can. But it is smoothing and straightening, and it's making it so that if I wear a garment that's hugging my hips, you're getting a really smooth line. You can't see this. There we go. Can't see this on Zoom. This also has elastic garters that connect to my stockings. It's nice that it holds up my stockings. It's really nice that it holds down the bottom of my corset. I find that to be the more important element. And the other garment that I have on is somebody else just joined the Zoom. The other garment that I have on here is a brassiere. This is sort of the beginning of the history of the bra because the corset is no longer doing that job because it's sitting here under my bust. And this garment's job is kind of a smush and flatten because again, that's part of the silhouette here. It's not a very busty time period in terms of high fashion. And that's trickling down even to workwear. Corsetry is interesting because I think we have strong conceptions of what that means from a modern perspective. And it can be a hard one to put yourself back in time and think about what is it like to wear this garment and what does it mean to be comfortable in this garment. And this is another interesting moment in time for that because the 19 teens are the sort of first moment in several centuries where we start to see it being okay not to wear a corset. There are some fashions that are not designed for that. But in spite of that, there are always going to be people who are continuing to wear the thing that makes them feel comfortable, that gives them the structure that feels good to them, that has that sort of support that they're used to. And I think this is very true often if you start wearing something earlier in your life, you're going to continue wearing it because it provides support that you're comfortable with. And so that's true with the corset here. This isn't, there's not a ton of boning in here. It's not wicked constrictive. It's really providing a pretty simple job. And for those of you who have a little bit of a sense of the rest of 20th century dress history, you'll see that this is about to become a girdle. It's about to drop lower on the hips. And the modern evolution of this, of course, is Spanx. So we still have a version of this garment around. We don't wear it all that often. I don't. But it does exist, right? I'm going to put on one more layer of clothing so I'm not standing here in my skivvies, and then we're going to look at some more slides. So I had this on before. It is a corset cover. Name is in the, functions in the name there. I'm used to doing 18th century historic costuming. 20th century, I get elastic. It feels very fancy. It's sort of interesting to remember when things that feel modern come into existence. The zipper is also being prototyped at this point in time. If you have a brain like mine, there are some very good histories of this, of the invention of the zipper out there, so you can read all of that. It's quite the process. Okay, there's my corset cover. This is my intermediate underwear. It's covering up my undergarments so that you're not gonna be able to see them through my outer layer of clothing. And same deal, I'm gonna put on a petticoat or an underskirt. For the people on Zoom, I'm gonna show up. This happens to have a particularly nice vintage lace ruffle on it that I just really like. So otherwise the people on Zoom won't get to see it.
Eliza, what's the period of time that people are wearing union suits?
Ooh, that's a great question. I'm trying to think about when they go out. Probably like 1880s to 1930s, maybe for women, and then maybe a little bit longer for men.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe even shorter. Maybe it ends even sooner for women. What am I supposed to do with this?
You just do the video because you weren't. I took you off video.
Okay. Okay. I see.
Share your screen.
Great. Okay, show what this looks like. It's a drawstring skirt. It's a simple white top. I'm going to go back to screen share so there aren't two of me dancing here. Go to the next slide. Okay. So I like this outfit because it's a blank slate, pretty literally, and also because these are, speaking of garments that have a long lifespan, the idea of some kind of camisole or top and some kind of petticoat, this really spans decades of women's fashion, these sort of simple intermediate layers. And I want to talk a little bit about the rate at which fashion changes and different elements of design and style change. So these, if I was a super wealthy woman, if I was one of the daughters from Downton Abbey, maybe I have underwear that does actually have style to it that changes every year or every couple of years. If I'm a working class woman, it probably just doesn't matter that much. I know that from my perspective as a dress historian, if you find historic underwear in a museum collection or an antique store, it can be really hard to date because it all just kind of looks the same. So there are some things that move really slowly when it comes to style. And then there are some things that move really, really fast. Which is where this slide comes in. So one of the really delightful things about studying community plate and the Oneida Company is getting to look at the really stunning advertisements that get done over the years. And this is a range of 4 ads. They're from over the course of like two or 3 years, so 1923 to 1925. They're all selling the same thing. They're selling the same pattern of cutlery. But every single ad has a different woman in a different dress. Because the fashions, the high fashion, the style of women's clothing changes that fast. And the higher up you go, the wealthier you get, the more social prestige you're seeking, the quicker your styles change, right? And at a certain point, that's conspicuous consumption. You're buying things to show off that you can buy things, and wearing new things and throwing out the old ones. So that's really like the peak of fashion. Maybe even more so than dress would be hair. which also can change at a very rapid rate. You don't even have to buy anything, you just have to do it differently. So that's like one end of the design spectrum. We come down a little bit to me and my workwear here, which does change, but it kind of maybe changes at the rate at which I wear out my clothing. Every year or two, I'm going to refresh my wardrobe, and every time I get something new, it's going to be in the closer to the contemporary style. And then we come all the way down to things like durable goods. So an example that occurred to me the other day, one of my good friends bought a new car this year. She bought a Subaru. It's this light blue gray color, which is a new paint color for Subaru. And as soon as she got it and I noticed it, I started seeing this paint color everywhere, because it's very clearly like the new paint color that they just introduced. And it is also very similar to a lot of other colors I'm seeing right now. It's part of a fashionable color palette for 2022. They've picked it, it's their new color for the year, and that's intentional. But she's not going to get a new car in 3 years because she's sick of the color, right? That would be, well, Subaru might like that, but nobody else is going to like it. And no one's going to buy a car that they think is going to be unfashionable in 3 years. Very few people, not my friends. And so that color that Subaru has picked, they've picked something that's in style right now, but it's not so fashionable that it's going to make the car undrivable in half a decade, because that would be crazy. They know people are buying this as an investment. They're going to drive it for years or maybe decades. And nobody wants to look at a car in 20 years and be like, ugh, that color from 2022, who did that? The example that I think of this, the one color that tends to stick in people's minds is avocado green. Yep. Which is a color from a particular moment in time that we can all recognize, and it's a little bit too much, right? So the things that have lasted in that color, either people love it or they're like, oh God, it's avocado green. So when we make durable goods, mostly we want them to have that long lifespan. And this is what Oneida is doing when they're designing cutlery. So these are all the same pattern of cutlery. A lot of these patterns get made for decades. So it's made for this moment in the 1920s. It's pulling on design influences then, but it's deliberately muted down. It's a little bit conservative so that you can buy this. It's going to get sold to you by an advertisement that says this is an investment for, if you're getting married, this is an investment for your entire married life. And you really want that cutlery to last that entire time. Great. I am going to go on to another layer of clothing, which means I'm going to do the thing where I stop sharing again. And I'm going to put on some more clothes. One more piece of white clothing. This is so not, it's really good that I only wear these for public presentations, because I'm like, white terrifies me. So this is a shirt waist. Should have left the cuffs buttoned, would have been clever.
Is there any garment you didn't make?
I didn't make the socks or the shoes. Okay, shirtwaist completes. I think the derivation of shirtwaist, it's a little bit of a funny thing, right? Shirt plus waist, because we just call it a shirt. A shirt is a men's garment, it's a piece of underwear. A waist is a women's bodice. And so we have a waist that's styled like a shirt, and we end up with a shirt waist. I think that's why we have this funny compound word. So I have a shirt waist, and I'm going to also put on skirt. Do it without messing up my hair. I want this to lie smooth. I have that corset on for a reason. I want it to lie smooth over my petticoat, which is always a fun challenge without a mirror. You're all going to have to tell me if I get this right. And this closes with hooks and eyes. It's coming in right about this time, but it's kind of a hard sell, it turns out. The question was, what year did the zipper get invented? It takes them a while to get it perfected. I think the 30s, you start seeing dresses like featuring zippers in the 30s because it stops being a weird thing and starts being a cool thing. Okay, I'm wearing my my shirtwaist and my skirt, and this is going to be super reminiscent of one of those photos we saw of women working in Oneida factories during World War I. They're wearing basically the same thing that I have on right now. So this is another one of those kind of universal outfits that covers a lot of ground. Very sort of typical thing for a woman to wear to an office in 1920. She might also just wear it around as day wear, maybe even to a factory for a job that's not too dirty. I actually wonder if these women posed for this photo because I think it's incredibly impractical to wear white shirts to work in munitions factories, no matter what your job is. Again, me and the fear of the white clothing. So I may be projecting here a little bit. And this outfit is an opportunity to talk about some other design influences that are coming in. Around the time of World War I, we're going to start seeing military influences coming into all clothing everywhere. It's pretty subtle on this. If I'd had, I don't know, more time, if I hadn't forgotten, I would have put a big pair of pockets on the skirt, which is one of the really clear indicators of military style from this moment. It does have this strapping and this big buttons, and that's totally a pull for military style. To some extent, I even think that the sailor's collar is doing the same thing. So we're evoking current events. They don't have anything directly to do with these women's lives. I'm not wearing a military uniform, but I'm showing support for what's going on in the world by the choices that I'm making in my clothing. It's also a pretty simple outfit. The lines here are not particularly complicated. I have a simple skirt without much adornment. Same thing with the shirtwaist. There's a little bit of lace, but the lines in general are pretty plain. And this is a bigger design trend for this moment. And I think of this as a style boomerang. I live around the corner from a high school, and so I've been watching high school kids like walk home every afternoon for months. And it's very apparent in my mind that the fashion for skinny jeans is over and the fashion for baggy jeans is in, like, now, because that's what I'm seeing walking past my window. That's a fashion boomerang, right? We've gone from one extreme to another. And the same thing is happening between Belle Epoque, so the first couple of years of the 20th century, and the 19-teens and 20s. We've gone from this very elaborate late Victorian style to something very simple, very straight up and down. Boyish is often a word that gets used to describe this period. And we can see the same thing going on in the designs that Oneida is putting out. So we have the 1904 Avalon cutlery pattern, beautiful sort of florid Art Nouveau detail, and it's covering a lot of the spoon. It's not just on the handle, it's kind of coming down around the bowl as well, heavily ornamented. And I've pushed the limits of my talk here a little bit by, just for contrast sake, the other pattern that's up here is the pattern from 1930 Noblesse, which is really Art Deco. It's very clear and crisp and architectural. And we're going to see in a minute that the designs from the teens and early 20s are somewhere in between. But we're seeing some of that simplicity that's showing up in dress, also showing up in things like the cutlery here. And some of this is also that simplicity is also the effects of those progressive ideas that we were talking about in the middle of the 19th century, starting to resurface on a more mainstream level. I'm gonna keep talking about that because I'm gonna go to another slide. Okay, this might be my favorite of the Oneida advertisements. Such a striking image in the middle. And there's also just so much going on with this. So I want to use this image to talk about Colonial Revival for a second, which is another type of style influence. So this is calling back an earlier time period in history. to be part of the style of a particular moment in time. I'm gonna pick this apart for a second. We have our woman in the middle in her, this is probably sportswear. This would be a good outfit to go golfing in, frankly. Simple lines, very straight, very elegant, but made out of very basic building blocks, right? She's sitting in a Windsor chair, which isn't the first place your brain is supposed to go. It's maybe not even the fourth place your brain is supposed to go, but it's there so that subconsciously you're drawing this connection between her and this much, much, much older design moment, looking all the way back to the origins of our country and the ideals that that embodies. Some of those are a simpler way of life, the sort of ideals of the American society and government, the birth of those, and also this idea of really things that are made right, things that are made by hand in a really quality way. Those are all assumptions that we're making subconsciously when we see something like a Windsor chair that's evoking this colonial revival period. Colonial revival is a style movement that mostly shows up in architecture and in interior design. It doesn't show up as much in fashion. Which isn't to say that it doesn't show up at all in fashion. Certainly it's showing up in costumes from this period. And I have thrown in one more slide here just to show you what that sort of same historical influence does look like in dress. This is an 18th century gown and a gown by the House of Levine, which is a French Paris house, French fashion house, Parisian fashion house. And this is called a robe de style. And it is a very classic shape for the 1920s in that it's a pretty straight and boxy dress, but then suddenly at the hips, it poofs out over a pair of paniers, so false hip support, to evoke this shape of the 18th century. We do this today, even fashion designers often are pulling elements from other moments in history to evoke an idea, to make you think about Marie Antoinette, etc. So I just want to say that it's happening as colonial revival for chairs and houses and cutlery, and it is happening a little bit for fashion, even if in a slightly different way. So I'm going to talk now about this Oneida design. This is the Adam pattern from, I think, 1917. Close enough. I think I first read the title of this design, and then I saw the image, and as soon as I saw the image, I knew what was going on here, which is that it is referring specifically to one Scottish architect from the late 18th and early 19th century, Robert Adam. And so this is a page, this is the page selling the cutlery. This is a page of Robert Adam's designs. And what they have done, and it's Grosvenor Allen, the cutlery designer for the Oneida Company, who's done this. He's pulled a motif out of this architect's work, and he's dropped it onto a knife. And he manages to evoke this other moment in time by doing that, but he's really just kind of plunked one element on there. And the rest of the knife is still really simple. This is not a piece of cutlery that looks like it's from the 18th century. But it is evoking that moment in time by pulling one single element and making that connection for us in our brains. And it's still going to sell Oneida cutlery to middle-class families who want something that's a little bit nicer, something that's nicely designed, but is still sort of a reasonable and conservative choice, something that you're going to pick and keep in your cutlery drawer for the rest of your life. It's walking a very interesting design line here between pulling from specific influences and giving customers what they really want, which is nothing too wild. Fabulous. Okay, I have one more piece of clothing. I'm just gonna, we're gonna escape here for a second. I think in the description for this event, I mentioned a chore apron. This is that chore apron. So this is really workwear. This is a piece of protective clothing. I'm gonna start sweating as soon as I put it on, so I better be done soon. That goes on over the rest of my clothes, or if I'm cleaning the house on a Saturday morning instead of the rest of my clothes, so on over my undergarments, something to wear around the house. has belt across the back. There's just a little bit of fitting. You see it also has buttons that I just neglected to use. Maybe roll up my sleeves while I'm wearing this. I'm just going to show you one thing before I turn my screen back on so people can see it. Do you see that the body of this is cut in one piece with a sleeve? Okay, great. That's the thing I needed you to see. I'm going to share my screen again. So the thing I really love about this garment is that when I started doing this research, I just found it everywhere. So when I started looking into workwear from this moment in time, it was this garment that kept appearing over and over and over again. So what we're seeing here, oh, and I'm sorry, that's dark and a little tricky to see here, is 4 examples of essentially exactly the same piece of clothing. On the far side, we have a model in a Sears catalog from 1922. You could buy it at the store. Here we have one of the examples of a woman working in Oneida in World War I. You can't quite see it here, but she's got that waist belt on as well. It's a little hard to see the rest of the garment, but that's pretty much exactly what's happening here. We have a woman working in Queen City Cotton Mill in Burlington, Vermont. And then we have an illustration from a dressmaking manual by Mary Brooks Picken, published in the 1920s. And that had the instructions that I followed to make this piece of clothing. Because a lot of them are scanned and online. You can still read them and make whatever you want. And the thing that caught my attention when I was reading Mary Brooks Picken's directions was that she was describing this garment as having a kimono sleeve. I'm not wearing a kimono. And I'm not wearing something elegant and made out of silk. What I'm wearing is a garment where the sleeve is cut in one piece with the body. And this has been done throughout dress history. Like, it's a very easy way to make a sleeve. It is not unique to kimonos, and in fact, it is not quite how kimonos are made. It's how we say it. It's how we say it these days, often in the Western world. So why is she choosing to use this phrase, kimono sleeve, to describe this chore apron? And the reason is that here is yet another design influence at play in early 20th century clothing. This is playing on ideas of Orientalism or Japanism, specifically if you're looking at just Japanese design influences. And this is another super common kind of design influence to say, ooh, what that culture is doing is really interesting and exciting and maybe exotic. Let's borrow some of that. I think it's a fine line between borrowing and appropriation, and we're doing a much better job of talking about that these days. And it would be interesting to do a thorough analysis of what the difference between appropriation and borrowing for this moment in time for the 1920s. And I don't know that we can even pull that apart. I do want to recognize that that's part of what's going on here. But those influences are super strong at this moment in time. They are strong because of a couple things. Japan was a closed society for, I think, centuries and wasn't allowing trade with the West until the middle of the 19th century. As soon as they open up, they become absolutely fascinating to everyone in the Western world. And so every Japanese thing you can have is just delightful and interesting, and everybody wants a piece of it. In 1910, the Ballet Russe performs Shaharazad in Paris, and that sparks off another wave of Orientalism. This is also a great period for Egyptomania, so people interested in Egyptian design, and all of these things kind of fall under this auspices of Orientalism. And we see it also, obviously, in one of our pieces of cutlery. This is like that Colonial Revival idea. It's a very small element on this very simple spoon. This is the Birds of Paradise design from 1923. And those little birds there are sitting in that little motif. That's absolutely playing at least a little bit into this same theme of Orientalism. So we've reached the end of my chair of garments. We've reached just about the end of my slideshow. And I hope we've sort of touched on the many, many kinds of influences that can play into design, how they're playing into clothing, how those same things are affecting everything all the way down to the cutlery that you put on your table. This is just a lovely spread of handles from Community Plate. Some of them we've talked about, most of them we haven't, I think, but that is where I'm going to leave it. And I would be delighted to have your questions.
We'll open up for questions. We do have one on the Zoom chat since we've had a lot with live in person. I'll ask this one first. So we do have a question from Alejandra, who asks, what kind of impact or lack thereof had the showing of your arms, i.e. that 1926 black dress you show?
Oh, that's a great question. I think even by the late 19th century, that's becoming pretty standard for like evening wear. We're starting to see, the question was about showing the upper arms. I don't know if the mic is picking that up or not. And I think that any level of scandal associated with that, the ship has sailed on that. So that's would have been an issue for the fashion critics maybe 50 years earlier than this. Yeah.
What would you purchase, or what would you have been able to make yourself? Or, I'm sure there are people who can make everything themselves, but what was like,
what might you anticipate buying versus?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you that a lot of the research I did for putting this outfit together was in the Sears catalog. And I can buy all of this.
Yeah.
And then I did a bunch of research in dressmaking manuals, and I can also make most of it. The garment that I don't think you're going to see anyone making at home is the union suit. That's a very specialized industry. You hire me to do a talk in a couple of years, and I'm going to do one on the underwear mills in Bennington, Vermont, because I think that's a fabulously cool topic. But that is a specialized industry. They're making those in the same way that you would make socks. You can make them at home. They're at this point easier to make in a factory.
Because it's like a fine knit.
Because it's a fine knit and the seaming is really complicated. I struggled to sew this on my domestic sewing machine because it's not meant to be made on a sewing machine like that. Yeah. I think corsetry is also one that you're much better off buying. I think it would be pretty obvious if you were wearing a homemade corset at this point in time, and that would be pretty uncommon. And then if you want something with nice finishes, the inset lace is a tricky thing to do, and I think mostly that's something that people are buying from a specialized manufacturer. Yeah, and a lot of this is being made in factories, so it's not necessarily go to a dressmaker, but you can just order it from a catalog in your size. Oh, that's a great question. Were the fabrics being manufactured in the United States? I don't have a strict answer for that. I think most of them could be. I think probably all of the printed cottons, there's no reason that they shouldn't be. And certainly there are factories making dress woolens. So like the skirt is wool. It's actually partially wool. So that's a textile you can certainly buy here. I'd be curious to know, probably a lot of the lace is imported and maybe some of the finer cottons. But I haven't looked into that in great detail. That's a great question.
A question in the Zoom from Train, which is a great museum question. Train, are there examples of the woman all garment, or are there only ones that survive in photos? Like, are there any ones in the wild?
Yeah, so I'm a dress historian who started with the 18th century, and mostly for the 18th century, things live in museums. For the early 20th century, things live in people's vintage shops on their Instagrams. So I did a lot of research for this by scrolling through vintage dealers' websites and social media, looking for garments that they had that they were selling and hoping that they had tagged them correctly. And there were definitely a handful of examples of woman-alls. There are also a couple of patterns and examples of ones for sale, and maybe just some straight up sewing directions. But yes, there aren't as many examples as I would like, and I don't think I found one that's actually in a museum collection.
I mean, it's one of those garments that's made to be completely destroyed. I mean, you're working in it, so it's not like you're really saving it. It's not a wedding dress, right?
True, but it is also maybe something that you wear for the length of one war and then pack away and never wear again. Maybe not, but that's a potential that they have a very sort of finite use, and so after that use, is through. Somebody's maybe going to save it if it has some particular meaning to them. The last time I did this talk, I did it in the other order. So I started dressed and I stripped. And that was nice because I could pass the garments around at the end, and I can't do that now because they're all back on my body. So.
Can you talk about the weather? Like, did we see in some of the slides that apron would have been more without everything underneath?
Yeah, so the question was about the weather, but I think there's another part of that context too. What do you wear underneath your house dress or your chore apron? What I see is that in context, when women are wearing this as a protective garment at work, they have a change of clothes underneath. And when they are wearing it at home, they do not. And so my thought process is that they come to work in their street clothes, they put the work apron on over that, they work their day, and then they take it off and they can go home in clean clothes. But if they're getting up in the morning to do chores around the house, they don't bother with that intermediate step unless somebody is coming over, at which point that's maybe a different question, though maybe you just wear something completely different in that context. I was really fascinated by the gradations of sort of apron to dress for this moment in time. This one is more on the apron end of things. There are some that are definitely more on the dress end of things. This feels like a dress, right? It doesn't feel like an apron, but what I'm saying is there are some that get much more, much fancier, but are still falling into the same category of like thing you would only ever wear to do chores in. A house dress. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So apron dress sort of thing, house dress, actual dress that you wear out into the world. It's a real gradation that we maybe don't have anymore. Yeah.
Well, one way you might be able to figure out to Chris's question about like sort of changing is to look at the factory blueprints down at the silverware factory. Was there a changing room?
Yeah.
Right? There's a men's room and a women's room for changing,
Yeah.
right? Locker rooms.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was. I think that's a 19th century phrase. And this was a funny thing for me. This got called a house apron, a work dress. Like the language is pretty mushy, basically. Yeah, I don't have a Webster's dictionary answer for you. Oh, moo, right? Yeah, we have more. Yeah.
To jump off Chris's question, is there a lighter version of a union suit? Like, do you have your summer weight and then your winter weight or something?
This is my summer weight, right?
Gotcha.
This is. I mean, and there's one shorter length. Mine goes down here below my knee. There is a version that just ends mid-thigh. So that's like the lightest one. The one slide I wish I had put in here. I guess that's the one slide that I wish I had put into this slideshow that I didn't is the Lady Seal Packs ad, which Seal Packs is a company that's making union suits mostly for men. They have a women's line called Lady Seal Packs, and the advertisement is this woman, and she's going like she's in the middle of a sprint, which is talking about the culture of athleticism, which is another big part of sort of changes in women's lives going into the 1920s. And she's doing it in just her looks like a tank top and shorts union suit. Just like, and the tagline is sometimes like, just like Brother has, like they're really selling it for some sort of gender parity through this underwear.
I'm sure you've heard of the TV show, The Golden Age.
Yeah.
It's been on. I just saw today that they're looking for extras to, and they filmed in Troy and Albany area, but they've got to get measured for the corsets. And, you've got to have hair this long and this way. And, those people are by and large very upper class, and the way that they're dressed is different than Mr. and Mrs. Jones living a few blocks away, right? Would the ordinary people also wear all of the corsetry and everything that their higher-ups, so to speak, would be wearing?
I think it is most often a difference in material quality So this is a question about how does class level affect the garments that you're wearing. More about material quality and the really sort of fine fashion details and how new your stuff is, rather than the actual garments that go into an outfit. And there are exceptions to that. But for the most part, in particular, I think we have this idea that if you're not fancy, you don't need a corset. And mostly that's not true. I mean, and this is where we can draw analogies to our own lives. Do we feel that way about bras? No, right? So that's the analogous piece of clothing there for that concern, particularly for that time period. Maybe that's changing by the time period that I'm talking about here. But the Gilded Age is set at that florid, slightly earlier moment in time. The Avalon cutlery, not the noblesse, right? Yeah, I have a couple of friends who were extras in the first season, by the way.
Really?
Yeah. So they're horse women, so they needed someone to tend the horses, and they got to do double duty, not just being extras. But.
Well, also, Kat, to that point, it's like when you see like Mrs. Russell in the Gilded Age, right? Like she is in like the finest of the finest silks and like hot fashion. But then you see someone like Peggy, right, who's solidly middle class. It's really a degree, not kind, right? It's still some of the same shapes you got going on. It's just it's materials and more foo-foo design, right?
Yeah, and ornamentation.
Yeah, the jewelry and all that stuff. Yeah.
I admit that I have yet to watch the Golden Age.
It's fun.
That's what I hear. I hear that it's fun, and I have I suffer from the inability to watch costume dramas without a high degree of criticism. Sometimes takes the fun out of it. Certainly for the other people with me. So.
Can you just talk about dress length? When I was thinking 20s, I was thinking kind of flapper and I don't know, almost to the knee, and that.
Well, the irony here is that I cut the comment about dress length because of talk length. But you're absolutely right, and I think I think the irony here is that this is almost the length of the reform dress for the Oneida women. So compared to 70 years earlier, this is short. But it's still pretty long. And this outfit really is floating right around 1920. It could go back as far as 1917. You may have noticed that in my talk. It's hard to say. The 1920s is a better phrase than 1917 to 1923, so forgive me. But yes, skirt length is totally an element of this. What are the influences going into skirt length? War is always going to be a huge one. War often comes with material rationing, often comes with rising hemlines. We see that massively during the Second World War as well. And I think maybe it's a little bit less true in World War I. And then we have these ideas of women being able to move more freely, doing more physical exercise, and those are influencing hemlines too. I think the flappers are like little floozies, right? I mean, they're not the norm for the 1920s. They're the party girls going out on the town wearing the most outrageous possible clothing. And so the majority of 1920s fashions are floating more around mid-calf, a little shorter probably than what I'm wearing, but not as short as we may picture in our heads. This is one of the funny things about that mental image that we have of the 20s and the things that are right about it and the things that are a little over dramatized.
Okay. One more, if anyone has any questions.
Is this the norm for European women also?
I think it is pretty similar. When I first did this research, I was focused really closely. I was looking at textile mills in Vermont. I was looking at textile workers. And that was where I was focusing my research. But honestly, it's much easier if you let your lens be a little bit bigger. You get more examples that way. And so there are certainly some, like some different styles in Europe, but it's traveling pretty well. And we're picking up a lot of French fashion too, like Paris is where all the fashion houses are. So it's not that they're imitating us, but that we are definitely picking up style from them. So it's a pretty well-informed world in terms of fashion and people borrowing and looking the same or following similar trends. Yeah.
All right. Well, Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all for coming on Zoom, and we'll see you next time. Take care.